Microsoft just released their 2025 Annual Work Trend Index report. I wanted to take a moment to talk through the report, help you understand what I think are some of the key concepts within it, and also help you maybe connect it to other research and other industry trends. So with that, let me dive right in. Inside the report, you'll find online, the report has a PDF and a web-based version of it. I do encourage everyone to look at things yourself. So use this, as a reflection or way to improve your understanding. In the beginning of the report, they do talk about this idea of using intelligence on tap. And they have some great stats and insights around how people are overwhelmed. So the truth is that organizations, right, employees, leaders, organizations themselves have ever increasing variety, velocity, and volume. Think of it, you have to be faster. That's the ever increasing velocity. You have to manage and create, deal with more demand and expectations from customers and partners and peers. But you also have an ever increasing amount of content. Think of communication and how the volume of communication and content is exploding with the usage of Gen AI within workplaces and within the broader, consumer society. So in both of those instances, we see increasing pressure on volume. And we also have an ever increasing variety. Think of all the anything to anything that AI provides, right? I have more video, I have more form factors, I have ever increasing features and capabilities. And so it becomes really difficult for organizations, for leaders, and especially for employees to manage their way through that. And so this isn't surprising. But what is interesting is this analogy of it being intelligence on tap. So what Microsoft is basically saying here, I think is fair. Today, intelligence in these AI or post-gen AI tools is becoming, more of a on-demand utility and less of a scarce talent resource. So in the early 1900s, as an example, there was a big transition where, factories stopped running their own generators, they plugged into the grid, and then output really exploded. In similar capacity constraints here, if we can tap in to this intelligence, utility, this AI intelligence too cheap to meter utility, then we actually could potentially address some of these concerns and have this explosion of output. And that's what leaders, organizations, and many people are trying to do with AI today. But it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. As an example, one of the things that the report gets into a little bit later on is it talks about this journey to being a frontier firm. Now, a frontier firm is something Microsoft is describing as kind of an industry leader that's really pushing and using AI at the forefront of their work, really leading that AI transformation effort. And as a person who works as a CTO and works with hundreds of customers that would probably classify themselves as frontier firms, I can tell you that there is a difference, right, when you work on that leading edge, and there's a lot of benefit, to working on the jagged edge of AI. But it's hard because the jagged edge of AI means that we don't always know if things are going to work out. There's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of learning there. So when they break this down into a series of phases where for employees, when we think about it, we start with using it as an assistant, then we work with using agent teams, and then we have sort of this human-led, agent-operated state of business. I do think it's a good analogy. So as an example, today, the vast majority of organizations are still struggling with using Copilot or Gemini or these key AI tools in their organizations to drive that digital assistant layer successfully. And I can tell you, it's the secret to success. It's what drives the most impact. Once you've got that going, it's a lot easier to start doing these agents or these more complex levels of automation. And there's different types of agents. I think this is a little bit disingenuous, but when you think about this, what we're looking at is human agent teams are actually just people using, instead of just the core capabilities of the digital assistant, they're starting to use it as an agent. So an agent could be deep research or the researcher agent in Copilot. It performs a series of activities for you based on your direction, but it's actually calling a number of different capabilities within an AI stack, a number of tools that it's using, or even sometimes other agents. A project management agent in Copilot would be another similar example, the analyst agent. These are all examples of agents where humans would then use the agent to orchestrate those activities. And that is where we're at. For most organizations, there's experimentation, there's usage of this, and this is where most organizations are today. There is there are scenarios where organizations are doing this, agent fleets is another term that's often used, but this idea of human-led and agent-operated style of business, this autonomous agent model where, you give a lot more flexibility, you give a bunch of tools, you give some direction to, the AI tooling, and then it comes up with how to solve these problems. And this is certainly the future, but right now I would say that this is very focused. It's very particular for like customer service scenarios, or a lot of times where we have a process that is just non-existent today. So we use AI to kind of fill that. But I do really love this analogy. So when you read this report yourself, or if you're looking for a good analogy, thinking of frontier firms is a good term. And I love this idea of phasing ourselves through our own progress. The other one that I wanted to talk about is the work chart. So Microsoft has this excellent analogy where they talk about going through an experience where you start today around, we all focus on, our functional expertise, and our organizations are designed based on org charts that are, aligned with that. But in the future, we're going to see more and more of this dynamism, this idea of work charts, which are really based on goals and targets, that outcomes are what we're orienting around instead of functions. Excuse me. And this empowers agents to act in, the analogy that they use is film crews, where they gather per project. But I really think in general, we're going to see more of this. So there's this other stat within the report a little bit later on, which talks about the human agent ratio. And so this is a really important metric. And I really like the way that they've talked about this. I think this is something everyone needs to really think hard about in 2025, especially as we approach the end of 2025 or the second half. So if we have too few agents per person, then we're absolutely going to miss out on potential efficiencies, right? If we have too many agents per person, then people get overwhelmed, right? It's really hard. It leads to more burnout. The biggest problem is that people can't scale to meet judgment, decision-making, other expectations there. And so you got to find this optimal balance. Now, this isn't necessarily the optimal balance for the org. This could be the optimal balance for a department or a functional area. And this is where I think it's important to understand that while the model of a work chart instead of an org chart is correct and is definitely the future, I think there's a big transition that we're going through. And it's really important to recognize that teams of people do work, generally speaking, in departmental and functional areas. So let's lean on that. Let's take those teams of people and let's think about the team and what's the right human to agent ratio for that team. And I think that's the right level of depth. We don't need to just think about departmental or regionally. We need to get to the team level. If you can get to the team level and you can start to understand what is the right ratio, which will change over time, as new agents become viable and you get research agents, analyst agents, well, you're going to change your ratio a little bit, right? Because now everyone's going to be using those. Those are provided in the, the Copilot licensing you probably own today. So this idea of adjusting over time is going to be really important, but I do think the team level is the right model. And if we use the team level, then this work chart becomes really actionable because work charts are outcome oriented and they often align with a team, and teams can be dynamic. Teams can be cross-functional, right? And so I think that, just my preference would be to orient yourself around that kind of analogy. So let's take it from a different perspective. Another thing within the guidance is this, they have this path forward suggestion set. And so in the end of the report, I know I'm skipping way ahead, but they do have a couple ideas here. And I really like this particular one. So the idea here is that you hire your first digital employees and you treat these agents, these capability sets, almost like you would treat an employee. And I think this is a good analogy. You onboard them. So if we take the deep research or the new Copilot research agent, if you think about how you would use that in the organization, you'd want to go to teams, again, team level, and you'd want to introduce teams to this agent. You'd want to onboard the agent to those teams. You'd want to assign ownership responsibilities. Like, what are we as a team leader maybe, or a manager, maybe I'll do this, but how are we going to use this agent? Now, some of this can be orchestrated from top down. We can give guidance on when and how to use these tools. But certainly, again, this is stuff that needs to be at a team level. And then measuring the performance is an excellent point here. And this is hard. Right now, these are the right expectations, but can we do it? If you were to ask me literally right now, how do we measure the efficacy of some of these agents? You're really out of luck. The reports aren't quite there yet. Now they're coming fast. One of the announcements that came out around this report timing is that the Copilot control system does have AI app and AI agent usage data now. We have better reports for monitoring, for managing and governing it. And because we have that, we can start to see things like, where is the satisfaction? Where is it successful? Where is it not? And so that means in our examples of first-party, third-party agents that we're using, in research agents, like we said, when we onboard them, we can also start to get a better feeling for where they're working well and where people are struggling with them. And so again, this is an excellent idea, but I do think we need to be practical about how to do it. We want to do it from the top down, sure. You need centers of excellence, things like that. We want to use teams as a mechanism at the best lowest level. I wouldn't do this individually, because onboarding, agents in a perfect world to every individual is great, but it's just not practical cost-wise today. So what you want to do is use teams as the lowest mechanism, and then you onboard teams of people to agents. As you do that, you help them assign responsibilities, and then again, you measure their performance. And I think that this is excellent. These are really good ideas here. All right. Another thing within this that I think is very helpful is that Microsoft also talks about this idea generally of this frontier playbook, where you hire, you kind of work out your ratios, and you scale. So for this, I wanted to talk a little bit about some tools. One of the tools that also was announced recently is this ability to do people skills. And people skills, presents really easily. You basically now have AI rationalizing over your data within the organization, your content, your documents, the meeting names that you create, things like that. And it's saying, it looks like you have these skills. It's really quite accurate. It's over 80% accuracy. So it suggests these skills, and then basically people then can confirm those skills. And so what this means is we now have richer data, not just using AI, as an intelligent utility to access and gain more value from our data, our content, our resources, our processes in the business, but now our people themselves can actually have AI reason over the work they're doing on a continual, recurring, and high-frequency basis, and essentially map out those skills. Where are the skills developing? Where are they growing? And where are they changing? And this creates a really wonderful opportunity, because what it means is that over time, we'll start to better understand how skills work in our organization. This idea of work charts, this idea of really transforming our organizations towards these frontier models, it requires us to understand our people, and we need to see how those skills get mapped to AI over time. Some skills AI will do reliably and consistently better, and those are skills that we will devalue as an organization and individually, and then eventually societally. So those are things that will happen, but that doesn't mean that there won't be new skills and new demands. And so what we want to do is we want to measure and understand this both as individuals for our own career and growth. We want to do this as leaders, and certainly we want to do this at the organizational level. So while it's easy to kind of underestimate it, the people skills announcements from Microsoft and the progress here is actually quite notable. The other piece in there, this is again at the path forward, they do highlight this idea of getting to the broad scale fast. And so while I highlighted a little bit around the human agent ratio, I think again, people skills is going to be one way we support that. This getting to scale fast is not new. It's not just that we need to be AI ready and we need to deploy these things effectively. Every organization needs to move from left to right as fast as they can. What I mean by that is they need to move as quickly as possible to scaled deployment and realization of value, because that's where the significant gains are, not just in productivity and quality, but actually in growth measures. Let me use an example. There was another report from Microsoft, one of my favorite ones from recent years, called the AI Strategy Roadmap. In it, the Ipsos group and Microsoft did a whole lot of research, again, just a few years ago, and they analyzed AI readiness and how AI works, and where organizations are more successful with ROI versus others that aren't. And what they basically found, to simplify it, is that it's these later stages of AI deployment where you get the big significant benefit. It's in these later stages when you're doing the realizing and post-scaling, right? Far beyond baseline digital assistance, but really we're getting to agents and we're doing proper scale. That's where you start to get the real ROI, the most significant gains. And interestingly, and I don't think this has changed, as we look at that, as you get further to the right, as you get into scaling and realizing, your emphasis on productivity gains and cost cutting and things like that reduce, and your focus shifts more and more to growth measures. Growth measures would be things like, I want to drive more success within my organization around revenue attainment, around customer satisfaction, around a bunch of different metrics like that, innovation, etc. And those are all impacted the most in this far right side. So what that basically means is, in order to drive our success, we need to do that and move from the left to the right faster. We need to get to these later stages faster. And I think that that's a great next step that Microsoft suggests. In the other section around every employee becoming an agent boss, I also thought this was a really interesting part of the report. So basically in the report, it does talk about this idea of every employee being an agent boss. This goes back to that idea of our agent ratio, right? What's that journey look like when we go from, being individuals who are using digital assistants, Copilot's helping me as a digital assistant. So now I'm using, Copilot and other experiences like that with agents. So, research analyst agents, project management agents, custom agents, third-party agents, etc. And now the sort of third category, as we mentioned, is this fleets or autonomous agents, this idea of really orchestrating things in a broader sense. And what we know is that leaders do drive this. Now, interestingly, I think you really want to understand this research a little bit more. There is some really good stuff around how they did the surveys. There's some good stuff in here, but I thought it would be worth just explaining this a little bit more. What we found consistently across organizations is that, as I mentioned earlier, teams is the right lowest common model, right? Because a team has a shared interest. If you're going to assign licenses, you want to assign those licenses to a team of people. When you do that, and I assign, to this team, what ends up happening is the team leaders or the managers. Now, these can be, role authority, like they actually are managers, or they can just be leaders where, they are influencing relationship management wise, driving a team's success. They don't have to have the role authority. They don't have to be a manager to necessarily fit this mold. But it's those leaders that are actually driving the big change. And I think we see this in a few ways. Obviously, Microsoft's own reporting here is sharing that, right? So familiarity with agents, that's leaders primarily. Regular AI usage, trust with AI, high stakes work, expect to manage agents, and so on and so forth. It's all leaders all the way down. Now, why is this? Well, it turns out there are lots of other reports and models, but I think one of the things that leaders do is they do a lot of delegation. Any team leader, it doesn't, again, need to be a manager. Any person who's in that kind of role, they learn the importance of delegation. And while delegating to AI is different, it follows a slightly different model. This is the acronym that I use a lot when I talk about it. We define outcomes, we explain context, we link resources, right? We establish guardrails. If we use this kind of concept, we do delegate slightly differently, but leaders are used to more of this kind of pattern. And so it's more accessible to leaders. But it's not just that it's easier to do it in this way. It's actually important because what also happens with leaders is that they feel the pressure to do this. There is overwhelming pressure, going back to our increasing velocity, variety, and volume. It's leaders that have to meet that need. And so leaders feel the pressure, and so they try and make it work. And this isn't just in Microsoft studies. There's an excellent report from McKinsey earlier this year that I really love. And in this report, they actually show how it's actually managers other than your own manager, overwhelmingly, over 50%, if you think about the encouragement of using of AI, actually comes from managers. So when people are learning about AI and they're starting to use Gen AI tools, it's managers overwhelmingly, again, over 50% between these two groups, representing that transition and change. And I actually think peers, when we overlay things like team leadership and things like that, you see that that's where a lot of these peers are actually driving from. So what we know is leaders or managers or team leaders, they're the ones that are actually encouraging people to use these tools. And that's shown in report after report. In that same report from McKinsey, there's also, just for reference, a great report on how managers themselves are typically the sounding board. So when employees are working through Gen AI and they're trying to use it well, they're going to reach out to their managers and they're going to say, hey manager, how might I use this better? And they're going to, there's a frequency and a rhythm there, but that is increasing. That managers or leaders, again, different types of leaders, that those people are the ones that are going to be really driving it. So that makes sense what Microsoft's finding. And I think this is also a really great opportunity to talk about another data point in here. So Microsoft has a bunch of charts in here, and they talk about when people turn to AI for things, and maybe employees can't do or humans can't do. And I think this will change over time, but I do think, generally speaking, there are some good use cases of using AI. But I really love this particular data point. So when they looked at the data, they found that 46% said they see AI as a thought partner. I think that's really important. So one of the things that we see in our own research and our own work with customers is we see overwhelmingly the leaders who look at AI as a thought partner, who use it not just for hard skills, but soft skills as well, right? So an example that I do is I have a automation where Copilot asks me, I actually have it daily right now, where it says, hey, I give it a persona, so you're going to be a wonderful leader for me, a leadership coach. And it asks me these questions. It says, like, is there something someone's done recently? Is there, a challenge that's happening? And as I answer these questions, it reasons over other context, like the development goals of those individuals, what else has been going on, and gives me very specific suggestions on ways that I can proactively recognize people, or proactively connect people, or proactively, delegate better my own work, the things that have been coming in from my own work. Like, hey, you actually have this new email that came from your manager asking for this new work, or this customer just made a request for something. This is a great opportunity for this person who's trying to develop that skill, who just had this recent success. You see what I mean? We start to combine those things together. So using AI in this way, not just for, outcomes and specific scenarios, but using it as a partner regularly is something that I do think leaders tend to do more effectively, and they have a greater demand and expectation that they need to do this because they themselves can't keep up as a good leader to be proactive unless they use AI to help them. So I think that this makes a lot of sense. And I really just love this idea of, being a thought partner is probably a great term for this. And I think that more people should not just think about using AI for hard skills, right? Helping you with research, helping you aggregate something, doing some analysis, etc., helping write more personalized communication to an employee or something. But they should use it a lot more for soft skills and development and things like that. All right. So let's talk about one other data point, and that is, I think terminology matters. So in Canada, we have this term double-double, and if you're ever at a Timmy's or Tim Hortons, you often see people saying, I'd like a double-double. This means double cream, double sugar. And so everyone knows what that language means. Well, leaders have their own language as well. And one of the things that I think is an unfair expectation is that employees don't always understand all these patterns and challenges that leaders have to face. And there is a crazy amount of terminology and inside baseball, terms and language within the AI space. So while leaders may be leading and learning about these things first, that doesn't mean that we should, lean on or double down on, some of these terms. We do need to get better at talking about these AI changes and things like that, not just as they become more accessible to everyone, but we need to do it in a way where we're not excluding, but we're including others. So I do think that's a good highlight, and just kind of goes back to that idea of using it as a thought partner. I think thought partner is an interesting term because it's not saying it's your partner. It's not really your co-pilot. It's just like it's your thought partner. It's helping you think a little bit differently. And I think that's a little different than saying it's something I delegate to. All right. So the last item here that I thought would be really helpful is to just talk about this frontier firm a little bit more. So there's this insecurity concern many people have, and I think it's really reasonable, and it can be frightening. When frontier firms are working on these things, they do have this advantage. They're learning about, different ways to use this a bit sooner than others. And so I do think it's notable that frontier firms generally are less worried about AI fears than others that are not. I think it's notable that leaders who are using AI as thought partners also rank much lower in their fears or concerns here. So I do think, if we're worried about job loss, it's important to understand things like people skills that I mentioned earlier and how those correlate with AI. It's important to understand that this transition is happening. So the sooner we ourselves in our own careers lean into it and understand it, the better. And there's this term everyone says, like, AI is not going to take your job. Someone who uses AI better than you might take your job. And I do think that is still the prevalent narrative that's happening today. But I'm optimistic in some of the newer reporting that does show that there is this understanding that's growing that people are actually the capacity constraint. So if intelligence and AI becomes more and more feasible, as you invest more there, you can actually keep your people and reorient them and then scale and drive more growth. Again, in the later stages of AI deployment, when we start to focus on growth instead of cost cutting and productivity gains and things like that, instead of those things, we start focusing on quality, we start focusing on innovation, we start focusing on, retention and satisfaction and, more revenue. In all of those models, what we find is that's where you have a capacity constraint of people, not cost or AI. And that means, again, you're going to see overwhelmingly a shift, hopefully, of more and more demand for people in roles where they can help scale this AI capability set. So I thought that would be a good way to kind of end this and talk about the seismic shift that's underway, this leadership and influence pillar that's been going on. And so if I could ask you to do something besides reading this report and some other great things, I would really encourage you to say, what's one thing that I'm not doing with AI today that I could do starting next week? And again, most people were really bad at cognitively switching in the middle of the day. So maybe pick something that you're going to do not in the beginning of the day, during the day, but in the beginning of the day or the end of the day. So at the beginning of the day, like I do with my automated prompt, I have that wonderful opportunity to kind of think a little differently with AI. At the end of the day, let me use that. Maybe do something different. All of us review meetings and probably use AI to do meeting recording notes and things like that. What if you asked AI, what were different perspectives in this meeting? Summarize those in a nice table for me. When it creates the notes, it doesn't really talk about perspectives and differences of opinion, but that could be really helpful for you to understand what's common across meetings. Is there a common set of perspectives that seems to be aligning a certain way? Or maybe you have a meeting that just feels a little bit off. So ask AI for a little bit of help and say, hey, AI, is there some way I could have been, higher emotional intelligence? Is there things I could have done better in this meeting? And then, reason over what it's saying. Don't just look at the meeting notes, but use it in your way as a thought partner. Use it in your way to build your skills, to grow your skills alongside AI's explosive growth and skills. And you'll find that you also probably will be a little less worried about the future of work in AI. I hope this has been helpful for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was the stat or insight that really stood out to you from this report? And is there some other research or other things that you've been seeing that really are just amazing and need to have more visibility or to be more aware in many leaders' minds? I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time. Bye for now.